trade facilitation. Yet we know how the discussion on the impacts of climate change on agriculture has often focused on changes in temperature, rainfall, and CO2 concentration will affect the suitability of the temperature in different regions. As some of us know, the IPPC fifth assessment report indicates that decline in global crop yields could reach 10 to 25% or more by 2050. So this is quite alarming. This site event, therefore, is really aimed at enhancing the understanding of the IPPC and the impacts of climate change on plant health. We will hear interventions from the plant health community at the global, regional, and national level. It is essential for countries to manage pest risks, to protect food security, the environment, and market access. We believe that strengthening capacity development, improving infrastructure, and implementing international and national strategies to tackle pest introduction and spread are central to the success of addressing climate change. The mandate of the IPPC addresses all these areas in terms of pest risks analysis and the global movement of plants and plants products. I wish us all here and the speakers a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, can I kindly request Mirko Montuori for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here representing the Secretariat of the International Plant Protection Convention, or IPPC, and speaking about the importance of plants and subsequently plant health with regard to climate change, and also the IPPC role in all this. This is actually the first time that the topic of plant health is broadly discussed in a Conference of Parties on Climate Change meeting. So we're pleased that the UNFCCC Secretariat has approved the concept note for this side event and allowed us to be here with you today. We know how the topic of climate change has been the focus of many recent studies, but most of them have been related to other aspects of climate change and also of the entire food and agriculture chain, including plant health, animal health, and food security. So we really hope that this conversation we're having today will help highlight more the role and importance of plant health into the overall discussion. If I may have the first slide, please. So my presentation will actually focus on three key questions. The first one being, why is plant health important? Why it matters? The second point is, how climate change increases the impact of pests, if it does? And finally, why is international cooperation through the IPPC crucial? So let's start with the first question. First of all, plants are essential because we all know how they produce the oxygen we all need to breathe. They also are at the basis of human and animal food chain, making up over 80% actually of our diets. And they're also the basis of non-renewable energies. This is an aspect we don't think of very often, but we know how the non-renewable energies like carbon, gas, and oil are nothing different than solar energy fixed by plants millions of years ago. And so to cut it short, plants are really the source of life, food, and energy on Earth. Yet, those plants are at risk As you can see here, from left to right at the top, we would see some examples of pests affecting major crops, and some examples I brought here come from Aprocerus leucopeda feeding on Ulmus cultivar. Then we see Tuta absoluta that is affecting tomato plant. The third example that we brought is that of a red palm weevil affecting a palm leaf. And finally, Mediterranean fruit fly affecting a citrus. On the second row, you may find how a tree, like a series of plants, olive trees, have been affected by Xylella fastidiosa, a pest affecting mostly southern Italy and Apulia. You do find an example of a pear also affected by the São José scale. And finally, a pine forest in the Turks and Caicos that has been affected by the pine tortoise scale insect. So as you can see, there are some relevant effects and impacts of plant pests on plants, but this has a subsequent effect also on the global harvest that, according to very conservative estimates, make up 10 to 16% of losses in the global harvest every year, resulting also in over 40% of global food supply that is lost due to plant pests. And the economic impact of this is huge. We have estimated in FAO at least $220 billion per year lost due to plant pests. Another example is that of the importance of plant health towards food security. This is a slide taken, a photo actually taken in Madagascar in 2002. Previously, this was a rice field, now completely affected and destroyed by water hyacinth, which is an invasive alien plant. So subsequently, the rice production in the area has been severely affected, and this has had huge economic impacts at the national level. Another example is that of the emerald ash borer, which was first detected in 2002 also in Michigan, and since then has laid down and affected over 1 million ash trees. What you may find surprising is the fact that this pest also affected human health, not only plant health, but due to the large number of trees destroyed in the area, research proved that the levels of asthma, stress, and cholesterol, as well as mortality rates in the area, have increased for humans since the appearance of this pest. Another visual example is this slide, where you can find the pests of concerns in North America in the years 1996, 1999. So we find how there's quite a number of relevant pests of concern for the United States in this period. But if we look at only a few years later, in 2009, we see how this number has more than tripled. And we saw that this increase is actually happening over time. So this is really an issue that has a significant impact on the national economies and trade. So just wanted to highlight the very basic, the very most important reasons for pest increase. So all in all, the increased movement of goods and people around the world has certainly increased the possibility of pest establishment and spread in countries. But and here comes the second part of my presentation. Does climate change impact also on pests? Well, we actually have clear evidence only that climate change is altering the distribution of pests, although this is really hard. It is really hard to actually predict and assess the impact of those alterations in the distribution. We certainly know two things. One is that climate change allows species to appear earlier in places where they were established later in the year. And also that climate change, and so especially increases in temperature, allows for pests to establish in areas where they could not establish before. The third element is that climate change also threatens, obviously, the survival of certain species that are essential for the actual survival of plants. And one other example is that of a potato leaf hopper. This is a very concrete example where climate change and so increasing temperatures brought the average appearance of this pest to be 10 years earlier than in the 50s. So this has certainly brought damage of economic significance in many countries. Another study shows how the pests can extend their range with climate change. This is a prediction of the spread of water hyacinth towards the poles that has been the object of a study in 2012 by a researcher and a colleague at the IPPC Secretariat. This slide is perhaps the more storytelling. Of course, we all know how the world needs to increase the food production at least by 50% if we want to meet the projected demand for the growing population we will have in the world. But at the same time, the actual threat posed by pests poses some concrete risks to this. And here comes the third and final part of my presentation. I would like to say just a few words about the importance of international cooperation in the IPPC framework. So first of all, the IPPC is an international plant health agreement that has been signed in Rome in 1951 and ratified the following year, that aims to protect both cultivated and wild plants by preventing the introduction and spread of pests. This is our mandate, and as a convention hosted by FAO as an Article 14 body, we currently have 183 contracting parties, some of which are sitting with me here today. So the objectives of the IPPC are mainly to protecting sustainable agriculture and with it food security, facilitating trade and economic development, as well as to develop phytosanitary capacity in the countries to support them in avoiding the introduction and spread of pests. So we do this through setting international standards on phytosanitary measures, and by exchanging information and developing our capacity, the country's capacity through assistance, also in cooperation with FAO. Finally, the IPPC is crucial for the implementation and reach of the several UN Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, when it comes to food security and zero hunger, and also partnerships, naturally, as well as economic growth, consumption and production, climate action, and life on land. We may want to discuss this more in details if we have time, but the idea is that IPPC is trying to make a difference in climate change, mostly through four activities. First one is the already mentioned exchange of information between among contracting parties. So it's important that all the contracting parties are well aware of the obligations of the convention, and we seek to facilitate the exchange of information. The second major activities is that of capacity development. We also support the surveillance activities that are held at the national level. as well as we are starting now to widen our cooperation with environmental-related conventions, and especially biodiversity-related ones through the BLG, or Biodiversity Liaison Group. And finally, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll leave the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirko, for that presentation, giving us an insight to IPPC, its work, and also the food production for security. The next speaker will be in the video, Lois Ransom from Australia. Is the video ready?
Well, hi everyone. I'm Lois Ransom. I'm the chair of the IPPC, Commission on Phytosanitary Measures. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I've been asked to do a brief introduction for you, and I know that my colleagues will provide you with much more information about plant health and climate change and the role that we as an international body can play to help with adaptation and minimising the impact of climate change. So first of all, I'd like to just give an overview of what the IPPC is, where you can get more information, cover a little bit about what climate means to plant health, and then talk about what the IPPC can do to help countries that are facing the impacts of climate change and adapting their trading systems and their risk management systems to deal with the changes in pest status that might arise from changes in climate. So the IPPC is an international treaty. It has 183 contracting parties, which are countries. It is there to allow countries to work together to reduce the international movement of plant pests. So it makes provision for government roles and responsibilities. It has requirements around exchanging information and pest reporting. But it also develops standards and helps with implementation of those standards to reduce the international movement of plant pests. So for more information, here is the IPPC website. So a copy of the convention is there, a lot of background about what the IPPC is, some of its major programs, and the importance of plant health generally on things like achieving global food security, protecting the environment and facilitating trade. So why is climate so important to plant health? So what I've done is draw up this pest triangle. Anyone who's done any plant pathology will be very familiar with this. And basically the environment and climate is absolutely critical because of its impact on a pest and the interaction of that pest with a host. So a pest or disease is totally dependent on the environment in which it finds itself to create the disease or the damage that we associate with that pest. So some of the considerations are around the pest are how does it spread, how does it survive, what sort of weather conditions does it need, what's its interaction with the host, and what controls we might have available to us to control or manage the populations. From the host perspective, the susceptibility, the resistance or tolerance of the host will have an impact on the amount of disease or impact that you have. What we do find is that the more stress that the host is under, the more likely it is you'll get more damage and you'll get more pests, and therefore you'll see some real impacts on the quality and the quantity of product that might be grown from that host. The environment plays a really critical role because pests and diseases often have a temperature range. Some of them might require water. Humidity is really important for diseases. The amount of light will impact host susceptibility. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air will affect host susceptibility or otherwise, or vigour. Salt in the soil. So with increasing drought or with big fluctuations in water, we can see some big changes in salinity in the soil. That can impact the host, and therefore you might increase their level of stress and therefore the susceptibility that the host has to the pest. So in looking at this triangle, the pests and diseases that impact the natural environment and impact crop production, yield, quality, the kind of measures that are applied in moving product around the world is really intimately connected with the environment that the host is grown in, but also the impact on the pest that we're concerned about. So what are some of the implications around changes in climate? We can see pests occurring in places where they've never occurred before, either because the climate has changed and they've moved to another area, or because the climate is causing a stress on the plant, which has become more susceptible to something that it may have had resistance to before. Climatic events, we've seen some really significant weather events off the coast of America this year. Hurricane force winds have the ability to move particularly insect pests into areas where they've not been before. In Northern Australia, we have an annual program to detect seasonal incursions of fruit flies, and then we mount a response. So knowing and understanding where pests are might be clear now, but with different weather patterns, extreme events, impacting on the survival and movement of pests, what we assume today may not necessarily be the same in the future. So thinking about the IPPC and how it can help countries in adapting to changes in climate. We already have a large number of standards. Those standards also provide guidance to countries and industries on surveillance, on detecting and responding to pests, in doing pest risk analysis, applying measures and managing international trade. We've got international standards on diagnostic protocols, and we're developing a lot more on treatments to help us manage pests and prevent their movement through international trade. We have an increasing program around implementation. So standards are really great, but you need to be able to implement them effectively. So we have an ongoing and increasing program around capacity development, and that can help our contracting parties to implement those standards and also to get the benefits around the more sustainable food security, trade facilitation, environmental protection. We have reporting obligations. So the Convention requires us to report changes in pest status. That becomes really critical when you consider that that pest status may change with climate change. So countries telling each other where pests are, where they're moving, can help us identify where there's emerging risks, and also it can also help us to facilitate movement or sharing of information, so that those countries that have experience in managing a pest can help those countries where they might have just detected it or climate change has caused a shift in the pest population. And finally, the IPPC provides a platform for collaboration. So it is critically important as we see some changes in climate patterns, in trading volumes, in things like breakdown of resistance or changes in host susceptibility, that we're actually sharing information and working together, that our researchers are working at a global level, because with increases in trade, hurricane winds, people movements, the pests that we have today won't stay in the locations they are, and so we need to be working together much more actively to help each other out and to share that information and work together to deal with these new and emerging risks. So I wish you well for the rest of your meeting. I'm sure there are lots of people who can answer any questions you might have about the IPPC. And I certainly encourage everybody to recognise this importance of the IPPC in helping countries prevent the movement of pests of concern, and to work collaboratively to give us the tools and technologies and to manage these new and emerging risks. So thank you and have a great day.
So that's the pest triangle. So just write down your questions. We'll answer it after having a round of these technical expertise tell us more about this topic. So I kindly ask Ralf Lopian, the IPPC contact point for Finland, to give us some technical aspects of the plant health and the climate change. Ralf.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Ralf Lopian. I'm a senior officer in the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland, and I'm also within the IPPC, the chairman of the steering committee for the International Year of Plant Health. And I'm going to give you a short overview over the aspects of how pests and pathogens are affected by different climate change occurrences. Now, before I'm starting, I think one has to see the big picture. The big picture is depicted very properly here in a word by the Director General of FAO, José Graziano da Silva, this year, saying there's no peace without tackling food security and eliminating hunger, and there will be no food without tackling climate change. And that has a very important impact, because we will reach, by 2050, 9.1 billion inhabitants on this planet. And that will be 34% higher than today. In order to feed this larger population, food production must increase by 70%. That's a number from 2009, so now it's 50%, as you have seen. However, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has, in its fifth assessment report, stated that for the major crops like wheat, rice, and maize, the staple crops which we have today, in tropical and temperate regions, climate change without adaptation will negatively impact production. And when we look at the fifth assessment report projections of predicted changes in crop yields, you will see how these impacts will be negatively affect food production and yields. And when you look at this graph, the blue ones are the positive effects of climate change. These are effects which are primarily in the higher latitudes, like, for instance, Finland. Finland is projected to have an increase in food production, while there is a more and more negative decrease in yield, and that will be primarily in the lower latitudes. That will be around the equators, that will be in subtropical areas. And these are predictions which are not even yet including biotic factors, like, for instance, pests and diseases. Now, we heard just in the speech before the triangle of pests. That is a school depiction of how environment, pests, and health interact. However, there is a fourth player in that, and that is the human, because humans also now take much more influence on the pest triangle. And we do not have any more than a pest triangle. We have a tetrahedron where the environment, the hosts, the pests and pathogens, and the humans interact with each other. When we look on the impact of temperatures and temperature increase on plant health, the warming of the climate, we have on the pests a number of impacts, direct impacts of higher temperatures. One is improved winter survival. That is especially in areas like the higher latitudes an important factor. Pests which have been killed off by cold temperatures in the winter are more likely to overwinter now when the winter temperatures are higher than before. We have an increased fertility of pests. Higher temperature means in many cases that pests can much easier reproduce, and they can reproduce in higher numbers. We have an accelerated population development. Populations of pests, especially of insect pests, can develop in no time. And if you have high temperatures and if you have pests which are dependent on a certain temperature sum to develop, you have an accelerated population development. And we have seen that in Finland, and we have experienced it, that some of the forest pests, which had in previous years only 1 generation per year, now come actually up to 2 generations per year and making much more damage. We have raised virulence of pests. Pests which, for instance, fungi or bacteria, viruses, can cause much stronger symptoms and damages to the plants. And we have better dispersal opportunities through higher temperatures. A reduced dormancy, many pests have a dormant stage where they stay for a number for a certain period of time dormant, for instance, in the soil or in the plant, and only start their real life cycle then when it gets warmer. We have increased growth. For instance, weeds can grow much faster and can outcompete plants in the field. And what we have already said, we may have an enlarged geographical range. And with a host, there is already what was mentioned in the speech before, the induced stress. Higher temperatures cause plants stress. And if there's a higher temperature and there's a stress, pest populations can easily attack and damage plants. In some plants, there is, with higher temperature, a breakdown of resistance mechanisms. Plants have, in many cases, a natural resistance to certain insects or to certain pests. And these can break down with higher temperatures. There's also a positive factor of higher temperatures, and that is, in several cases, it can be an increased lignification of the plant. That means the plant will be sturdier and more difficult to be attacked by pests. That is one of the few positive aspects of a higher temperature. The environment will also be affected by higher temperatures, and then subsequently also have an effect on the pests. We will have a change in the effective of national predators. So, for instance, also biocontrol agents may not work as well in higher temperatures on their target organisms. We have an imbalance, or there is a possibility of getting an imbalance in the development of a synchronity. Predators and pests, their prey, are developing in synchron. Their life cycles are adjusted to each other. And this synchronity can be imbalanced by temperature changes. And we have changes in the ecosystems which may affect the distribution and the pest and cause new pest introductions. Ecosystems, for instance, can be considered soil populations. It's a soil ecosystem. Until now, it is not known at all what higher temperatures will cause in the soil and how it will affect the millions of different organisms which are in the soil. Humans will also be affected by the climate higher temperatures and how they affect pests and diseases. There will be an extension of the production period more in some regions. That means an extension of production period means more pest possibilities. there will be, because there is more pest problems, there is a big chance that there will be an increased pesticide application, which again has some problems in how residues of pest plant protection products will be seen. We will have shifts in plant breeding because countries will want to adapt to climate change and will there then try to breed new varieties of plants. And we will have shifting crop production ranges where plants will be grown where they are not grown today. And we certainly will have an increased trade of host commodities, and that will cause, again, problems in bringing new pests to new areas. When we have the precipitation increase in plant health, that also has a number of impacts on the pests and pest distribution. With higher humidity and water, we will have fungal and bacterial pathogens which increased infectivity. We will have a competitive edge for certain weed species which grow faster and outcompete plants. We have an increased spread of pathogens and an increased growth, and we will have an enlarged geographical range of pests. We will have increased foliage in hosts, which again increases the possibility to infect them. We have susceptibility of plants which is affected by humidity. Plants which have, for instance, a constant water cover, water film on their leaves, will be easier infected by certain pathogens. And we will have changes in the plant architecture and the structure. The environment has, again, a change in ecosystems which may be affected by the distribution and by new pest introductions. Humans will, under increased precipitation, again, also apply more plant protection products, pesticides, especially for fungal diseases. We may have changing pest control practices and shifting production ranges. And again, an increased trade of host commodities. There are a number of other factors, not so many anymore. Increased carbon dioxide and ozone may affect the plant architecture and the plant physiology and structure, leading to a greater susceptibility of the plants to pests and diseases. And there is, however, also the possibility that an increased photosynthesis may slow down certain pathogenic invasions. Changes in wind patterns will affect the distribution of pests, and extreme weather conditions, hurricanes, tornadoes, act as long-distance dispersal vehicles for pests. Extreme weather conditions and their effects will weaken the plants and make them more susceptible to pests. The major challenges which the international community has to tackle in order to counter these problems, we have to look at the worldwide shifts in host distribution and cultivation, and because this will increase risks for pest distribution. We will shift, there is a shifting trading patterns will increase the risk for pest distribution. We have to look at the problem of new pests which will emerge, because a new host grown in a new area may cause a new pest to emerge. Pests extending their geographical range will cause extension of pest distribution. Pest surveillance by plant protection services throughout the world and diagnostics need to be improved. We need to survey pests and the pest situation in all the countries in order to see if something new has been introduced. And we need to strengthen the risk analysis for pests in order to counter possibilities of new emerging pests and their damages. We need to enhance plant health research and international collaboration, and this will be crucial. In order to tackle all these, the international plant protection community and Finland in particular have proposed that the year 2020 will be celebrated as the International Year of Plant Health. What we want to do is to raise the public and political awareness of plant health and to help governments and the international community to address these challenges for plant health. We need to look that we can strengthen global research in plant health, that we need to increase global collaboration in plant health. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if we cannot reduce and cannot adapt to the changes which are posed by plant health problems, we will not reach the goal to increase agricultural production and food production by the year 2050 as we have predicted it. And if we cannot achieve this food production, what will happen is food insecurity. And food insecurity is also human insecurity, and this may lead very well to migration and problems which we haven't seen before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ralf, for reminding us that human is the most important factor in all this triangle pests. And also interesting for the year 2020, the International Year of the Plant Health. And also a good reminder that the increase in population to 9.1 in 2050, we need to increase the food production, but by get rid of the pests, of course. So thank you, Ralf. We have the next speaker, Mr. Viliami Kami, the IPPC contact point in Tonga, will tell us the actual and potential effects of climate change in Tonga, the experience of Tonga. Thank you, Viliami.
Oh, there you go. Now you can hear me. Thank you, Paula. And, I think, we've certainly absorbed a lot of information from the previous speakers. And this time, it's just going to be really a reflection on what's happened in the Pacific Islands. And I think, this is the ideal forum to have it in, since we have, thanks to our neighbors in Fiji for hosting, the Conference of Parties 23. And, it is a reality in the islands, with regards to the impacts on plant health. And so I'll just go through, a couple of stories here for you. First of all, I think to a lot of people, and a lot of people around who are not in the region, when you see a lot of blue and not, you realize in thinking that, these our communities are more dependent on the sea rather than agriculture. But, that's why this map is nice, because it's actually, over 90% of the communities are actually dependent on agriculture. And so that was the region for you, and this is just a little bit on Tonga. This is, our islands are very small. I mean, you hear about us playing rugby, but, in terms of territorial, the territory, it's a very small group of islands. And, you can ride around the main island in a day. So that's how small we are. But, agriculture plays a big part of our kingdom. And as you can see, I'll just give you a very brief overview of Tonga, for those who are not from the region. We have a constitutional monarchy, and we do have a king and queen, and our population is about 100,000 people. There's quite a lot who are living abroad, and 169 islands and 36 inhabited. Our main economic sectors, tourism. Our whales are very good. They're very friendly. They like to pose for photographers, as you can see. But that's one of our main things, fisheries, and also agriculture. Now, in terms of the region, agriculture does affect at least 90% of the communities in the Pacific Islands. And that's why it's so important, and that's one of the reasons why we, made the effort to have this side event under Tonga, and to highlight this particular, the threat that climate change, presents to our region. And it actually, in terms of contribution to the economy, just for Tonga itself, up to 20% or at least, it has an important role in terms of food security and also health and especially trade. Our traditional crops are very important to us, and that's something that's unique about our islands, is that our agriculture is a little bit different. It's not all about rice and flour. Root crops play a big, important part to our region. As in, those who are familiar with this is, taro, yams, a very big, important part of our staple diet. Cassava, sweet potato, especially in Papua New Guinea, it's a big thing, and it's also a big thing in the rest of the islands as well. And, this is the thing that, when it becomes to a thing when this particular range of crops begin to become threatened due to, the influences of climate change, and then that's when it becomes a huge concern for us. And so, we've just gone through the whole fact, what are the activities and the impacts that these climate change activities have on the plant health. And in Tonga and in the Pacific Islands, I think the two major ones are cyclones and the long droughts due to El Nino. And as you can see here, this is just a drought here of the El Ninos since 1977, and that's from our Bureau, the Meteorological Authority in Tonga. And also we can see here with the cyclones, it's an increase in the frequency and also increase in terms of severity in the last few decades. And so this is where the real threats are. Now, in terms of the impacts on pests and diseases, it's the, as we mentioned here, it's outbreaks, but this is a real thing. Outbreaks, there's transboundary movements, and there's also movements within the country, and this is things that are beyond our control, but things that we need to address. And as you can see here, for example, we had a Category 5 incident on one of our island groups, Hapa, in 2014. And of course, we know about the damage, but then coming back again to the impacts on plant health, when we started growing, cassava is always a very resilient crop. It's probably one of the most resilient crops around, cassava. And, we have it as a backup, as a measure against, prolonged dry conditions. And what we had was, as soon as we started growing and the cassava recovering, there was a major outbreak of spiraling whitefly. Now, the main reason why is because, and then one thing that need to know is the importance of natural enemies. And, when you have a lot of times in the environment, in agriculture, there is a balance. There's you have incidences, but to a certain limit because of the action of beneficial insects, even in sometimes too, it's also diseases. And this is one of the things that happened was we had a huge outbreak because there was, the absence of a lot of these natural enemies. Because, a lot of times we think that, they're out and about, sometimes you probably won't even see them. But these are all very magnified pictures. But, as you can see, the natural enemies here are small wasps that are microscopic, and sometimes you look at a leaf and you can see a color, or probably the size of a pin top or something, walking crossing, and that that's the sizes we're looking at, and they're very vulnerable to pesticides, vulnerable to climate change, and when you have the absence, you have very, very good chances of huge outbreaks. And the same thing again in El Nino, 2015, had a major outbreak of, the public looked at us, we had, mango trees right across, all black, fruit trees and things. black again, just because of huge outbreak of scales. And the biggest reason, again, the impact on the natural enemies was a factor in this whole thing. And in cassava, we had big outbreaks of white peach scale. And this, again, all these scales, and that they have a lot of control under biological control. And but then again, as I said, these natural enemies, once they are affected, then you have a lot of good reason for these outbreaks. And and in short, you have the plants get stressed. You have these outbreaks, and it gets to a certain stage where you don't have that point of recovery because you've got huge populations that make it hard for these pests to recover in. And and it leads. The El Nino led to a drop. In fact, there was no more taro and you had to export in 2015, and because of this prolonged drought, and this had an effect on our exports. So, but again, this is again due to climate change. Now, when we talk about transboundary movement, there was the big case of taro leaf blight. We have two countries that are very close to each other, American Samoa and Samoa. And there were two cyclones in 91, 92. And then all of a sudden, American Samoa had the taro leaf blight. Then 1993, there was a huge outbreak in Samoa. And a lot of this was due to the fact of the two cyclones that in 91 and 2. So, and as a result, the impacts here were really huge. And it's just like the same thing, the thing with New Zealand is going through a recent outbreak, and that is due to, there's a new incursion, and they are now going through damage control measures, and that's because of the myrtle rust. And they have evidence now to support that the source is from Australia, and it is through, the winds. And there's been a lot of cyclone activity that has come through Australia and gone down further south. And then again, this is a big concern because it has an environmental impact too on things. So in other words, what's happened here, like the case with Samoa, taro is a major diet, is a major staple crop for Samoa. Not only that, it was the major agricultural commodity for exports. And, that for many years after that, they had to go through a recovery process. There was a lot of breeding for tolerant varieties, and then they introduced a lot of tolerant varieties. Then they had to do breeding, and then until they got to the texture that they were used to. And now they're back again into things, but the huge delays, it was probably for over a decade. And then, now they're back up and running. But this is a sign of, the impacts of climate change on plant health. And, for New Zealand, I'm not quite sure, the millions it's going to cost for them to try and control the myrtle rust that they're actually experiencing at the moment. And in terms of movements within countries that you've been listening to, I happened to grow up in Papua New Guinea, up in the highlands. I was there as a child for, 10 plus years. And even though I'm from Tonga, but my parents were missionaries there for 25 years. And it was always a safe area for, in terms of malaria. Because, there was always a belief that at 5,000 feet to 7,000 feet, so on, the vectors would never survive there. But things have changed now, and the impact was huge. I mean, there's a lot of loss of life amongst the children once the malaria went through that, and now it's there to stay up in the highlands in Papua New Guinea. And 40% of the population of Papua New Guinea live in the mountains. And so, and that is because, a lot of it is because of the slight changes and increase in temperatures. And, so these are the real impacts of climate change. And even though, it's a case in malaria, it was the best case I could think of, in terms of things. But, I mean, there is a need. And unfortunately, I realize, that, this is the first time we put this up in this conference of parties. But I think, it's a matter of really trying to push it through, that it becomes apparent to people the importance. We talk about carbon exchange. We're talking about, high level stuff, but we've got to start thinking of the communities. And in the Pacific Islands, that's the important part for us, is that, how do you get to think about climate change when you're not addressing their direct needs? We can talk about carbon footprints and so on, but, and our contribution globally towards this is not even 1%. But the impacts are much larger. And, the whole thing is, there seems to be a huge focus on that. But, we talk about addressing at all levels. But even in the conference of parties, there's a big interest in finance, a big interest in other issues, and so on. When we tried to apply to host in the Fiji Pavilion, the criteria came to us all high level, and we were refused, which is quite funny because, Tonga is right next to Fiji. We are very close. But when everything came at that level. But, we need to be feeding the people. We need to be talking, going out to them and letting them understand what climate change means and how they can benefit from it. And it is personally very sad to see that, all our talk is at that level. What about all the people at this level? The people in need of getting climate change addressed? It's not happening. This is the way it is. This is where the real need is. This is the people we need to address at this level, at the grassroots level, at the farming level. All the subsistence communities throughout the islands, they don't understand what's going on. It's not all, about this, what we're seeing in the conference of parties. Everything seems here. The attendance today is a good example. I see next door, I see the thing, it's all packed. But, there is importance to address plant health. And, we don't do it and we don't pay more attention to the needs of our communities right throughout the world, the globe, especially in developing countries. So, we're going to have huge issues. And so, that's why there was an important need, and that's why we need to be looking at, these impacts. We need to be, and I think it's really good to have that slogan about healthy plants for a sustainable planet. And also, we are very supportive of the International Year of Plant Health 2020 that's been proposed by IPPC. Mahalo apito.
So thank you, Viliami, for giving us an insight to Tonga's experience. And of course, in Tonga, they love their food. So it's really good to know about the pest control in Tonga. Our very last speaker for this afternoon, we have Mr. Dean Solofa from the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. He will talk to us about the climate-smart agriculture in the Pacific region. Dean?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again to Tonga for hosting this event and for the invitation for SPC to participate. I guess in follow-up of and in rounding up of the talks today, we've heard very serious concerns about plant health and the risks it poses to food security. So, maybe one would say that might be a bit depressing in terms of the future as to what to expect. So maybe, Chair, if you don't mind, I think this presentation hopefully will give maybe a little bit of hope about what is happening on the ground and what could be scaled up in terms of positive results. I am giving this presentation on behalf of Dr. Siosio Halavatau, who couldn't be here himself to deliver this presentation. My name is Dean Solofa. I am not an agriculture person or a pest and disease person. I'm a climatologist by profession, but I am the policy and planning advisor also of the Land Resources Division of the Pacific Community. So if you have technical questions to follow up from this presentation, I will be happy to relay them to Sio once we get back to Sio. why is climate smart agriculture, what is it, and why do we care? Well, I think this is what we're looking at is an integrated approach of the three principles of what climate smart agriculture is, and has been the subject of discussion over the past, I think, yesterday that we had all the FAO events. And there were three angles in which I think I heard consistent messaging, that there is livelihoods to be looked at, which is the first point, then adaptation, and then mitigation. And all of these integrated, I think, is the way forward, I think, that we need to pursue climate smart agriculture production, at least in moving forward for food security. So we haven't been waiting around for something to happen. We've been doing some work a lot of work actually, on soil health and its return to the Pacific countries. One particular project has been active in 6 countries: Fiji, Samoa, Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and Tonga. And this is to answer the situation that we're looking at the moment, which is this downward spiral of soil fertility. And so, figuring out some responses to that. Again, the focus here, unfortunately, this is biased a little bit towards soil health, but there was also an involvement of an integrated pest management approach in this as well. So integrated crop management and integrated pest management to help provide some of the results here that we'll be looking at. Again, the context and the issues: we have cropping systems in the Pacific that are looking at declining fertility, production as a result, and looking at then the structure and the biological health of the soils. One of the other things that we've noticed, at least from the soil scientist perspective, is that communities in the Pacific now are practicing less and less their traditional forms of agriculture. So part of this, the projects that we've been undertaking with communities has been to go back to the communities and really involve them in the research on how to return their soils back to good health through the participatory approaches. Our lead, I guess, comes from the side in terms of a bottom-up approach, which is with the communities, is to provide the science and the technical support to the program. We also have partners in this interventions, and we have FAO, we have the Australian Centre for Agricultural Research as well. So there are a lot of partners that worked with us in these 6 countries. And the results were good, but there were a lot of lessons that were to be learned as well. To start with, the capacity of counterparts at the grassroots level, at the farming communities, it's pretty low. So training programs have to be put together. There is a lack of tools, almost literally. I mean, we got to bring in spades, the wheelbarrows, and the equipment to facilitate the project. That's not a problem. We're able to do that. And some of the key lessons at least learned from here is the first thing that I think we learn in doing projects in the Pacific, in any community, and that is participation and ownership by the community of the project and the program. And that capacity building is not a one-off action, that you've got to make sure that you institutionalize this, that you make sure you put it in agriculture extension services, combined with agriculture research centers as well, to make sure that these things are put into programs for the long term. Research in the Pacific, agriculture research that has been declining as well over the past few decades. And we're showing in some of these small interventions that there is a lot of great returns for small investments in research. In terms of this climate smart aspect of it, there is this challenge that still exists in bridging the gap between seasonal climate forecasts and decision makers on the ground. On that second point, in terms of the lessons that we learned, I mean, everyone understands. I mean, the first point is that if you're a farmer, you understand the relationship between what it is that you grow, the kind of pests and diseases that are surrounding your crops, and their relationship to climate variability and climate change. On the second point, though, was an interesting finding, and for me as a climatologist, I completely understand this. So if you're from Tonga, you read that second point, it says preliminary results of work in Tonga suggest that any future improvements in forecast scale will not lead to substantial yield improvement. So my colleague in Tonga, Ofa Fanunu, I think he might be challenged about that, but I would say that he would also be happy about that, because I think we've taken the science as far as we can in terms of climatology. We produced very, very good seasonal forecast products. What the gap is on communication, how to translate that scientific information about future forecasting of rainfall, of temperatures, of humidity, that are important to farmers on the ground, to a decision point that they need to make about what investments they need to put in. Fortunately, we have partners in the region that are able to help us with this. So we have the partnership with ACR again to help us look closer into the seasonal forecasting situation and the closing of the gap around communication. So principally, again, focusing on the agriculture research and agriculture rural advisory services to bring them closer together. There are more learnings here. One of the things that obviously CSA tries to do is to have some results around soil carbon sequestration. So the reviving traditional agroforestry practices in the Pacific is one of the things that we recognize as part of the consultation with our community members. They're telling us of things that they used to do or their forefathers used to do that would return carbon materials back, soil carbon materials back into the soil to help enrich the soil. And we find now that that helps with carbon sequestration. So these practices that we used to have before gradually eroded, things that we need to bring back again. So our forestry people, they have an important role here to make sure that we're looking at the integration again of their role into agriculture. So again, just ensuring that we keep to standards and processes and good practice in agriculture. I'm going over time. Okay. This is a plug for the Global Soil Organic Carbon team. This is I guess a baseline study on of the soil organic carbon map of 2 different islands here. So the picture on the left is the island of Tonga in Cook Islands, and that's the baseline data that we recorded, that has been recorded from them about the soil carbon, soil organic carbon. And on the right is a picture of Tonga Tapu from Tonga. Now, the challenges around this was discussed yesterday during the FAO sessions, is that these things need to be homogenized over time. You have a global data set that has measurements of soil carbon that date back 30, 40 years. Even in the Pacific, it's very difficult to set a good baseline that everyone can start off looking at over time for change. So things like field soil test kits, which are very expensive, but I think we will try to spread around, create some reference networks within the Pacific, and start measurements for tracking. Again, almost the very same SDG goals being reflected here from the earlier presentation. I think the only one that's missing is Goal 1, but the ambition here is to try and get our countries to be re-reporting under those. This is the last slide. This is one of CEO's, Dr. Halavata's more famous slides around our organization. It's a spider web, and what it is in this approach of improving soil health, and with that the soil health treatments around pests and diseases as well. We're looking at developing baselines before the intervention, looking at the buying power or the non-rejection at market, the average yield of the crop, sales performance, the farming system, and a positive or negative change in yield. Pre-project, you see that blue, the closer it is to the middle is the poorer it is. And post-project, what we're looking at is a significant increase. So ideally, we'd like to hit the score of 5, which means a perfect, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, perfect hexagon. But that's something that I think we're slowly moving towards. And these kinds of projects, I think they're very small, but if we can scale them up, I think we can make some massive differences at the community level. So hopefully that's not too a bit of a positive spin towards the end of our event. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for giving us an insight. Food security is all about climate, smart agriculture. Now we're coming to the questions time, so the floor is open. To ask you, if you want to make a question, just state your name, your country, and also who you're directing your question to. So questions?
Okay, thank you. I'm Adi, I'm from Israel, and my question is for you, Ralf. Are you think that the countries and the IPPC should publish information about food products for measurements and not and reduce the animal products for because it's also healthier. It's need a lot less materials and land to produce more food, and with also reduce the emissions. So how the countries can have this information to the population and make a move on that.
Yeah, Ralf.
Thanks for your question. I think within the IPPC framework, countries are obliged to report on a number of obligations. One of them is whether they have an established MPPO or a contact point to that MPPO. There is also provisions that ask countries to establish pest lists and to make them available to the Secretariat, and then can transfer the information to the contracting parties who request them, etc. I think your question is more related to the national food safety systems that are under the framework of another international agreement, which is the Codex Alimentarius. Also in that case, it's always up to the contracting parties or members of the organization to come up with information that is then shared electronically and posted to our websites, the FAO website and the IPPC and Codex websites, and is made available to larger audiences. So it's really, this work on information exchange is one that both the IPPC and FAO are taking on at the global level. But it's also true that through our national contact points, there is a possibility to increase this type of exchange and to, let's say, inform the national communities of producers and also farmers and relevant organizations in regards to the food safety or plant protection data and information. I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's Sione from Tonga. It's just looking at the data and the statistics that you've provided, and I was wondering if the IPPC work closely with FAO in making sure that data, those statistics actually get fed into the IPCC assessment reports, because I think you mentioned earlier today this is the first time that IPPC has actually been a part of the whole COP process. And I was thinking with statistics and data like that, it needs to be involved a lot more and needs to be, well, my thought is it needs to be highlighted a lot more. If it could be made a more regular or even a more permanent fixture of the UNFCCC process, especially when it comes to COPs. The question would be, the panelists up there, would you continue to work in partnership in order to be a lot more visible at platforms, global platforms such as this? Because I think it seems pretty critical that you have a lot more involvement in this model.
Thank you. Mirko, you want to take that question?
Thank you. Yes, no, thank you very much for your intervention. I think it's essential to continue sharing information and working together at the global but also national level. So what I can say is that certainly all the data that FAO is producing are obviously publicly available and shared with relevant colleagues working on different in different UN agencies. But there is a need for us to explore more the collaboration also in view of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. This is why the IPPC Secretariat and its community have established yearly thematic years that every year focus on one specific aspect of the IPPC work. So we had the food security as the 2016 year. This year we are focusing on trade facilitation, and next year is going to be the year of environmental protection. Throughout the establishment of these years, we are more and more collaborating with relevant stakeholders in having an impact and effect on these themes. So we believe that certainly climate change is something that relating to environment that will be the focus of the next year and of further studies and information sharing. So thank you for your points. Those are very well taken.
Thank you, Mirko. Any other question? Yes, please.
Hi, Beverly from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So I thought your point in the talk on Tonga that a lot of these discussions are occurring on a really high level and not necessarily getting down to the people in our communities was extremely relevant. And so my question is to you and everyone on the panel, how do we get this information to our communities? How do we bring capacity to our communities? And what are the efforts in your regions to do so beyond what you've shown here?
Thank you. I think Viliami will answer that question.
I think, for example, this conference has a lot of influence in terms of climate change on the support that you can actually receive in what particular areas, etc. For example, like as I mentioned when we tried to apply to the Fiji Pavilion to host our side event. The criteria they gave us was way above exactly what we were really referring to. What plant health is really about. Addressing the needs at the community level. Trying to on pests and diseases, and as a result, even though we have a very close relationship, we were quite surprised that we weren't accepted, and it was a bit of a disappointment, really. But I think that's the reality there. But because on the ground, this is. We as each of the individual countries have to be addressing, these things as because a lot of this is beyond our control. For example, the examples I gave in Ha'apai, and that when these outbreaks occur in Tonga through the El Nino, and that we as the ministry then would have to take that the approach and make sure that we are able to mitigate in whatever ways we can. But then again, when we are looking for in terms of more support, funding, etc., we can't seem to meet that criteria, that is recognized, as a result of the Conference of Parties, and that's how we feel, so that it seems like that there is some sort of disparity between, it's not just up there where we need to be focused on. There's also immediate needs. The immediate needs are right down at this level. Yeah, this is this is what we need. This is where it's happening, on a daily basis. And that's what we're trying to say. That look, there seems to be a lot of focus up there, but what happens if a outbreak happens tomorrow? We're talking about forecasting, and that are we actually, paying attention to these to the effects of the changes in temperature, the movements of insect pests. How are we responding in terms of all that? The data is there, the scientific data is there, but it seems to be like all about carbon footprints and so on. It's fine. That's great, but is it really answering what science is saying, what all the work that's being done? So this is where we're concerned, and that's why we're happy that the plant health is coming into this conference. It's it's the first time, and Tonga's really happy that we've put up the flag, and said, okay, we want to promote plant health here, because to us it's really, really important, and especially in our region, climate change is a real factor. It's a real event, and it's it's a big concern for us. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you. And I think Solofa, do you want to add?
Just going back to that earlier question about the data, and a little bit linked to your question, we are on the verge of launching an effort to build capacity in the region around the collection of data, but particularly agriculture and fisheries data. And that's to help with the information building. And I think it's one of these things that end up being information being fed up to FAO processes through IPPC or what other branches of FAO they are. They will be used for our own national indicators and NSDS, national development strategies for decision making and for setting policy and strategies. So that's a piece of work that we recognize is of critical priority to the countries. So, it's collecting that highest data at the ground level, ensuring that highest data that we're looking at the household and income expenditure level, that it's as robust as possible to extract the kind of data that we want to look at for the current trends and changes that we're seeing on the ground, if we're able to trace some of that back to climate change impacts. There is, you said you were from the Oceans or Scripps Institute. There is some learning also, and I think hopefully what Peter's saying too is that at this ground level, that there is lessons learned across, that's socialized across communities as well. The LMMA's success in the Pacific region, and I think maybe globally as well, the locally managed marine areas, I think is the kind of success story that we'd like to replicate in our agriculture communities. That was not just, there's pests and diseases, there's agricultural biodiversity that we also want to promote. There's good land management practices, forestry management practices, a whole bunch of things in the agriculture area that we want to be working on and scaling up in these communities. So helping countries with the data to help with decision making, set policies, set good strategies are the way forward for us, I think. So it's partnerships again at the regional level and also at the national to community level, building that link and making sure that it's as robust as possible and that we're sharing those lessons and plans with them as best possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think to fully recognize this issue, just starve them for a day or two, and we'll see what happened. They were running for their food. After all, Malia will confirm that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I just want to maybe come back and touch a little bit on what Viliami was talking about. I'm not going to comment on the process in terms of the high level and how do we bring that message down to the community level, because I think that's a very important issue. What I want to kind of come back to is where do we see the issue of plant health come into the negotiation process? And I think that's important. And currently we have in the negotiation the issues relating to agriculture under the subsidiary body of scientific and or the SUBSTA, which is a scientific body, the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice. And I think if you remember, Viliami FAO hosted with the World Bank a workshop for negotiators on issues relating to agriculture. And I think perhaps this is an area where you and others in the agriculture departments can play a role in pushing the issue through that and have more visibility in the negotiation, because I think having that at the international level in policy and then trigger that, that triggers down to policies in Tonga and elsewhere. So I wanted to just share that with you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I think we are coming to the close of our session. Any, no? Just one final question. It has to be short. Thank you.
Sorry, just one final question. I'm just wondering, how does the private sector actually tap into pest control? We have been talking about community development, but how are they involved in the pest control? And because I see that's one of the sectors that can actually push pest control and and food security. Thank you.
So private sector involvement. Any quick response to that? Mirko?
Private sector actually comes to a large degree in partnership with FAO on a number of projects that are developed at the regional and national level. But one opportunity to further engage private sector will probably come through the establishment and proclamation of the International Year of Plant Health that we just mentioned. In fact, we are happy to report that one of our private sector partners was for the first time sitting in the steering committee of the IYPH last week. And through a discussion with them, we understood really the value of having relevant actors in the food chain working with us, both at the global level but also in the local communities, because we believe this work is really an added value to our work. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. I think because we already run out of time, I thank you all for your participation, and let's put our hands together to the panelists for the contribution. And of course, as you have heard, this is very important. It's about food security, and this is the very first time ever discussed at COP. This very important exercise. And as you heard from Ralf, that 2020 is the year to International Year for the plant health, and as you can recall, it will be the same year. So it's a coincidence that that's the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. But this is a very important topic that we have discussed, food security. So we talk about the impacts of climate change. It will come about 2100, full impact of it. But of course, human will be long gone by then if we don't eat, if we don't have the food security among us. So I thank you all for your participation, and good evening.